There is a photograph of Stewart Granger taken in the late 1980s. He is sitting alone at a table in a Santa Monica restaurant, still broad-shouldered, still bearing the angular jaw of a man who was once described by a studio publicist as the most physically perfect actor in the world. The silverware in front of him is untouched. He is looking slightly off camera, as though watching something disappear just beyond the frame. This man once charged into burning buildings on horseback. He hunted big game in Africa for sport. He fenced on camera with a surgical precision that professional swordsmen called genuinely remarkable. He was the highest-paid British actor alive. He married a woman who had literally been born a princess. And yet he sat alone, largely forgotten, nursing grievances about a world that had moved on without so much as a backward glance. This is the story of how a man who had absolutely everything ended up with almost nothing at all. Before we go further, I need a small favor. We are trying to reach 1,000 subscribers this month. We are so close. If this story already has you, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means everything to us. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. Every time we see a new place appear, it reminds us why we make these films. Okay, now let's get into it. The origin. James Lablash Stewart was born in 1913 in the old Brompton Road area of London, and from the very beginning he possessed something that is almost impossible to manufacture. A physical presence so commanding that it functioned like a kind of gravity. He was tall in the way that made rooms rearrange themselves. His bone structure was the sort that portrait painters had historically wept over. But it was not merely the architecture of his face that separated him from other handsome men. It was the quality of his stillness. Even when he was doing nothing, he appeared to be on the verge of doing something dramatic. He adopted the stage name Stewart Granger in the early 1930s, partly to avoid confusion with the American actor James Stewart, and partly won suspects, because a new name gave him permission to build an entirely new self. He trained at the London Webber Douglas School of Dramatic Art and served his early apprenticeship in the theater, learning to fill spaces far too large for a young man with no credits. He was not immediately celebrated. Those early years were characterized by a quiet, grinding persistence that his later mythology conveniently erased. The polished adventurer of the 1950s posters did not spring fully formed from the English fog. But the moment he found his footing on film, something clicked into place with an almost audible snap. His early British pictures, The Man in Grey, Fanny by Gaslight, Caesar and Cleopatra, turned him into the primary object of wartime female fascination in the United Kingdom. He was magnetic without apparent effort. He was charismatic without visible calculation. What no one yet understood was that the persona and the man were already beginning to diverge in ways that would take decades to fully resolve. And that the resolution, when it finally arrived, would not be kind. The scandal. Granger was not a man built for patience, and he was constitutionally incapable of conducting his personal life with any particular discretion. His first marriage, to actress Elspeth March, produced 2 children and an atmosphere of profound mutual dissatisfaction. By the mid-1940s, he had transferred his considerable intensity of attention to Jean Simmons, one of the most genuinely gifted young actresses Britain had produced in a generation. She was 17 when they first worked together. He was 30. He pursued her with a single-minded focus that he made no effort to disguise, and the British press, still operating in that delicious interwar space between moral indignation and voyeuristic appetite, followed the whole affair with gleeful alarm. The relationship was the talk of the industry. His first marriage formally ended. He married Simmons in 1950 in a ceremony that was simultaneously a love story and a declaration of war against every convention his generation had been raised to honor. The couple promptly relocated to Hollywood, partly for opportunity, partly to escape the withering gaze of the British establishment. Here is what makes the story genuinely complicated. Granger was capable of extraordinary tenderness. His co-workers described a man who would notice when a junior crew member looked exhausted and quietly ensure they were sent home early. He was, by multiple accounts, a genuinely loyal friend to those who earned his trust. But charm and self-destruction were woven through him in roughly equal proportion, and what MGM was about to offer him would accelerate both. The peak. When MGM signed Stewart Granger in 1950, they were not merely acquiring an actor. They were acquiring a complete archetype. The sword, the horse, the jaw, the smile, packaged in a single human being who appeared to genuinely enjoy the physical demands of the roles being written for him. The Hollywood he entered was in the final glory years of a very particular kind of fantasy cinema, and Granger was its last great native speaker. He rode without stunt doubles. He executed fencing sequences that the director of Scaramouche later described as the finest screen swordplay ever captured on film. The climactic duel in that 1952 picture, 7.5 minutes, no cuts, choreographed across 3 floors of a theater, became the sequence that practitioners of the craft still reference as a benchmark. King Solomon's Mines had preceded it in 1950. The film was shot on location in Africa with a logistical ambition that nearly destroyed the production, and Granger seemed to find the chaos genuinely invigorating. He hauled equipment through terrain that broke lesser constitutions. He did not simply survive the conditions, he appeared to absorb them. For a brief but luminous window in the early 1950s, Stewart Granger was one of the most recognizable men on Earth. His films grossed fortunes. His image appeared on the walls of bedrooms in countries he had never visited. He was, by any measurable standard, a genuine global star. And then he made a mistake that most triumphant people make at the height of their powers. He confused the permanence of his moment with the permanence of his relevance. What happened next, his marriage to a woman who was royalty by birth, is the part where the story takes a turn that nobody, including Granger himself, anticipated. The strange pivot. In 1964, Stewart Granger married Caroline Letizia Louise Josephine Sophie Janine of Luxembourg. She had been born into the House of Luxembourg-Nassau. She was, in the precise technical sense, a princess. The union was reported with the kind of breathless disbelief that the press reserved for events that seemed to have escaped the realm of plausibility. Here was a boy from Brompton Road, an actor, a professional pretender, marrying into European royalty. It was the sort of thing that happened in the scripts he used to film, not in the actual world. The marriage lasted for years. Its dissolution was quiet by Granger's standards, which is to say it was still considerably louder than most people's most turbulent moments. What the princess chapter represented, though, was something beyond romance or social assent. It was evidence of a man who had so thoroughly mastered the performance of an exceptional life that the exceptional life had begun to materialize around him as though summoned. He had willed a reality into existence through sheer force of projection. The problem was that projection, sustained long enough without genuine foundation beneath it, eventually exhausts itself. The exhaustion was already beginning, and what came next would be slow and merciless, and entirely without audience. The long decline. The world that Stewart Granger had been constructed to inhabit was being quietly disassembled around him through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, and the tools doing the disassembling were entirely cultural. The swashbuckling hero, square-jawed, morally uncomplicated, physically magnificent, was not merely going out of fashion. He was being actively repudiated. The cinema that replaced Granger's era was interested in anti-heroes, ambiguity, psychological complexity, and the deliberate discomfort of watching flawed men fail in ordinary circumstances. Dustin Hoffman and Al Pacino occupied the rooms that Granger had once commanded. They were brilliant. They were also everything he was not, and had no interest in being. He continued working. This must be stated clearly, because the narrative temptation is to present his decline as a sudden vanishing. It was not. He appeared in television productions. He took roles in European co-productions that reached modest audiences. He made westerns in Germany at a time when German westerns were, improbably, a genuine market. He adapted, partially, reluctantly, without particular grace. His third marriage, to actress Carolyn de Fonseca, ended in divorce. His relationship with his children, by various accounts, oscillated between genuine warmth and prolonged, bewildering absence. He gave interviews in which he spoke about his contemporaries with a candor that made publicists visibly uncomfortable. He was not a man who processed his grievances internally. He talked, he complained, he named names. He assessed his own career with a mixture of pride and barely concealed fury at the industry that had once lionized him and was now making conspicuously little effort to remember why. The fury was at least honest. It was also slowly turning inward, and what it found when it arrived, there was a reckoning of considerable proportions. The Reckoning. Granger published his autobiography in 1981. He called it Sparks Fly Upward, a title drawn from the Book of Job, which is either a deeply considered literary choice or an extraordinarily precise description of his personal operating mode, depending on how generously you are feeling. The book was extraordinary in a specific way. It was almost entirely without the strategic self-protection that characterizes most celebrity memoirs. He wrote about his own capacity for cruelty with what appeared to be genuine puzzlement, as though observing the behavior of someone he had shared a body with, but never fully understood. He wrote about the marriages with a candor that wounded several people who had not consented to being wounded publicly. What emerged from between the lines, more clearly than Granger perhaps intended, was the portrait of a man who had spent his entire life performing a version of himself so convincing that he had never developed any meaningful relationship with the version underneath. He was not without self-awareness. That was, in some respects, the most painful aspect of reading him. He knew he had made choices that were in some cases close to unforgivable. He understood that charm had frequently substituted for genuine emotional presence in his most important relationships. He recognized that the restlessness which had made him compelling on screen had made him exhausting and destabilizing in private life. Understanding these things and being able to change them, as Granger was discovering in his late 60s, are exercises in entirely different categories of courage. The obsolescence. By the 1980s, Stewart Granger was living in the United States, in a state of comfortable material provision and profound psychic restlessness. The money had not entirely evaporated. He had been prudent enough with the MGM years to avoid the full catastrophe that befell several of his contemporaries. But the currency that had always mattered most to him, which was attention, had become scarce in ways that no amount of financial stability could compensate for. He occasionally surfaced in American television productions. He appeared in miniseries. He did guest roles. Each appearance was greeted with a brief, warm surge of nostalgic recognition. He was still, into his late 60s and early 70s, an almost absurdly handsome man, followed by the swift return of silence. What made the obsolescence particularly difficult to navigate was that it had no clean explanation. He had not been canceled in any meaningful sense. He had not made a catastrophic public misjudgment that explained his peripheral status. He had simply been caught by the tide of cultural transition and deposited somewhere quieter, which in many respects is a harder fate than a decisive fall, because it provides no clear villain and no coherent narrative. His contemporaries were passing away one by one. Errol Flynn had gone in 1959, Tyrone Power in 1958, Clark Gable in 1960. These were the men whose existence had given Granger's world its coordinates, and the world's coordinates were being removed from the map with a regularity that clarified something uncomfortable. He had lived his entire life in the future tense, always moving toward the next role, the next country, the next relationship. What happens to a man like that when the future stops arriving with things in it? What happened to Granger was a kind of very quiet, very private, very dignified falling apart. The final years. Stewart Granger spent his final years in the Santa Monica area, in a house that was adequate by any reasonable standard and insufficient by the standards his nervous system had been trained to require. He gave occasional interviews to journalists who were writing retrospective pieces on Hollywood's golden era, and he was, by the accounts of those who conducted these conversations, simultaneously generous with his time and visibly pained by the exercise. Remembering, for Granger, involved returning to a country from which he had been permanently expelled, and the visa for re-entry was nostalgia, which he found both intoxicating and corrosive. He spoke warmly of certain collaborators. He spoke with undiminished precision about his fencing training, about the specific physical grammar of riding a horse for camera, about the technical challenges of performing in locations that were actively trying to defeat you. When he discussed the craft, an animation entered his bearing that his daily life apparently no longer reliably provided. His health began to decline in the early 1990s. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer. He managed the diagnosis with the same mixture of stoic performance and genuine inner turbulence that had characterized his management of most of the difficult material his life had produced. He died on the 16th of August, 1993 in Santa Monica, California. He was 80 years old. The obituaries were respectful, warm in tone, and brief in proportion. The particular calibration of tribute reserved for figures the world has already done most of its grieving for. The circle. And at the end of that extraordinary, improbable, self-invented adventure, he sat alone at a restaurant table in Santa Monica, still carrying the architecture of his great years in his face, looking at a world that had mostly continued without him. There is something in that image that will not entirely release its grip. A man who had charged through the world with so much velocity, who had been a genuine fantasy for millions of people, who had married royalty, who had fenced his way across entire continents of manufactured heroism, sitting quietly, waiting for a meal, largely unrecognized. The easy interpretation is tragedy. The more honest interpretation is something considerably more complicated. He had lived with a ferocity that most people never approach, even in their imagination. The cost of that ferocity, the broken relationships, the unprocessed grief, the loneliness that accumulated in all the spaces where stillness should have been, was real, and he paid it. But so was the life itself real. So were the horses and the swords and the impossible landscapes and the woman who had been born a princess. The gap between the life you appear to have and the life you are actually living is a gap that most of us recognize. It is not a failure. It is, in the end, simply what it looks like to have been human. Stewart Granger spent his whole life chasing a world that kept moving just ahead of him. And in the end, what he wanted most wasn't the fame or the princess or the sword. It was to matter, to be remembered. That's all we want too. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, please subscribe. We are trying to reach 1,000 this month, and every single person who hits that button is telling us that stories like this one deserve to be told. Don't let this be another thing you meant to do. We'll see you in the next one.